you guys should try this. Go to your Facebook account and find 2 ways of communicating the same message about social justice. The one that I chose had to do with economic injustice. So I put out a message first that said, I think it was something about screw the 1% or something like that. And I wanted to see how many of my friends would like it on Facebook. And about 15 or 20 of them did. You may have been one of them. And then I put out another message. I forget the exact one, but I scoured the internet for it. But it was a broad, very generic message that said poverty is bad, or something to that effect. And about 50 or 60 people liked it. So that tells you a thing or two about what tends to travel and what tends to be liked and not liked. So the ambiguous messages travel faster. Right? So in the words of movement frame analysis, frame alignment is easier locally when global frames are more ambiguous and polysemous. Right? So individuals with vastly differing personal ideologies can get involved in the same movement because the central frame or goal of the movement is itself vague and politically unspecified. You don't have to be a Democrat or a Green Party voter to like no war in Iraq. That's a politically unspecified slogan. Right? So, and that makes it easier for individuals to identify with and participate in that kind of digitized movement. And correspondingly, ambiguous and polysemous global frames end up traveling a lot faster. The second point that I wanted to make, I guess I have gone in the right order. It has to do with frame multiplicity. That in an earlier generation of social movements, messages were characterized by what you might call master frames. That is, so for example, in the late 1980s, LGBT movements were very successful in framing LGBT issues as civil rights, right? Effectively using a discourse from the civil rights movements in the West from the 60s and 70s. And that's what you might call a master frame. It is much more difficult to do that now. So I think of Graham Chester's work on who argues that highly mobile, technologically infused movements make it very difficult to keep conceptualizing a social movement as agentically or intentionally developing a single or a durable global frame with which an individual actor or even a small group can sort of align locally. Right? So instead, what they say, and what I think makes sense, is that scholars need to understand how contemporary movements develop multiple frames at micro and meso levels, right? And the potential of these local frames to disrupt, interact with, or displace the broader macro-level global movement frames. Right? So going back to a point that you were making in terms of, can one apply the notion of transition to Singapore? Right? And the reason that I thought that, maybe we should invert that question on its head is precisely this. In what ways can that particular frame of, as a communicative frame, how might that be adapted, transformed, disrupted in a particular locale? Because the likelihood of that happening now is much greater than it used to be. And that's because, the very idea of a master frame in a social movement is much weaker than it used to be, right? So these are some sort of really broad ideas about activism and the new dialogic. Okay, so I hope you've got a sense of what I mean by the new dialogic, right? This focus on connectivity, coordination, and exchange, and sort of the 3 consequences that it ends up having on, on organizational form, on the kind of communicative actions that people engage in, as well as the overall message frames that they develop. So are we clear on that? Okay. So let me turn now then to try and get us to think about what does connectivity and what does the new dialogic look like in activist practice. And again, over here I'll draw from some of my own work in Aotearoa. I should say that I use the word Aotearoa because it acknowledges the bicultural history of the country, particularly the central place of Maori, the Tangata Whenua people of the land. So the name of the country, as far as I'm concerned, is Aotearoa, New Zealand. That is the string that a lot of people committed to biculturalism actually use. So I just wanted to clarify that because that's not necessarily clear to anyone who hears me use that word. So in In a 2007 study that I did with Cynthia Stoll, what we tried to do was map a range of groups involved in global social justice in the country, and we identified 68 different groups, speaking with activists from all these groups. And what we found was that a lot of these groups did in fact meet sort of what you might call sort of like the definition of a connective action group, right? They were small, they're flexible, they're short-lived, and taken together, they all sort of form this movement, or movement of movements, as people have called them. Our network analysis, which I'm not going to put up, shows that they were actually highly segmented, as in there were peace clusters, environmentalist clusters, anti-capitalist structures, feminist, animal rights, socialist, anarchist, etc. And some clusters were more central to the network and other clusters were less. So for example, feminist groups tended to be more marginalized, even in the global social justice network. So one of the things that we asked activists was, what are your reasons for connecting with each other? And their responses were really interesting, because it really helped me clarify and expand what we might mean by networking logics. Right? I mean, if you ask people, why are you connecting? What are your reasons for this? Their responses, as it ended up, were pretty rich, and I think sort of helped expand the CCE model. So very often, when we ask the activists the question to describe their reasons for connecting with other activists, they reproduce some aspects of the CCE model. So look at this quote. I mean, look at the number of times the word networking itself appears in the quote. Right? So networking itself is a normative rhetoric that guides activist practice along the lines of horizontal coordination, consensus building, and the free and equal exchange of information. Right? However, excuse me, losing my voice here. There were some unique spatio-temporal aspects of activist discourse that we found to be pretty interesting. Am I one quote ahead? No, I'm okay. So some activists talked about space. So this one guy, so for instance, said, this is a small country, organizations are small. If something happens to one or two people, then that will be it for the organization. Conversely, because because the country is small, people know each other quickly, word gets around quickly, it's faster to pick up on issues. And that emphasizes something that I don't think is necessarily evident in the networking logic that people like Castells and Juris talk about, and that is smallness. It's about proximity. And that is a very unique feature of New Zealand. It is a small country like this one of 4 million people. Right? So how activists actually sort of communicate with each other will sort of, I think, take that into account. There is also an interesting sort of temporal continuity and a transcendent and historical we that activists often use. Again, I do apologize for this ridiculously long quote, but if you have the chance to scan it, you will see that this activist continues to summon the word we throughout this quote, but who the we is changes. But he keeps saying we. So he says, 97 and 98 were the years that I functioned in the collective. In 99, I moved to Hamilton. We did a bunch of things, a bunch of different things, anti-McDonald stuff. That was a big issue. We were kind of plugged into that. We moved in with another collective called Multimedia, which ran a place with a very similar sort of aims to this community information technology space. We set up a community newspaper in the inner city east of Christchurch, which we call The Smog, ran that for a couple of years. So you can see he's moving from one place to another, but there's a sort of continuity in that discourse, and a kind of transcendent activist we that sort of moves from place to place, even though the specific people are different. So I guess sort of my first conclusion, if you will, from this is that I think that the CCE model, if you can call it that, interacts a lot with practical and historical situatedness. Okay? So networking logics continue to be spatially and temporally situated. So activist practice in the digital era is obviously what Van Dyck calls a mix of virtual, which is understood, in terms of technological and global, and organic, which is understood in terms of local and emergent forms of social practice. And it is not purely in the realm of the virtual, as a lot of commentators would put it. And I think that is an extremely important point to make, because even when we're talking about technologically mediated action throughout, but even if you look at the specific kind of technologically mediated action, it is influenced quite a bit by its spatio-temporal situatedness. That continues to inform it. Okay, so let me turn a bit more specifically to the question of how the virtual, again understood in terms of technology and globalization, interacts with the organic, understood in terms of local and emergent in contemporary activism. So I'm going to do this through some insights generated from an event ethnography that I conducted in Occupy last year. And a lot of the event ethnography was was in Wellington, the capital of the country, on the International Day of Occupation, which was October 15th. And I used I sort of came up with this method on the fly, because I went down to Wellington because I heard that this was happening and I wanted to be a part of it, and I was like, oh my gosh, I've got to talk to people. I wasn't quite sure what to say, and I wanted to ask them what they were doing there and how they'd heard about it. And so I went in there and I just asked 2 questions of each person I spoke with, and I used my iPhone to record responses and take photographs later. So I said, how did you get here? And then I said, what does this mean to you? Not just how did you get here, but what does being here mean to you? And then throughout the day, what I started doing was taking photographs of the signs that people were making during the protest. And then I started asking them what those signs meant to them. And that ended up being a much more meaningful way of engaging with people, rather than saying, how did you get here? What are you doing here? Because then they thought I was a cop asking them what,